What's going on, everyone? This is Ryan Eckert with Peak Endurance Solutions, and you're listening to the VO2 Max podcast. How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to another episode. If you're a regular listener, and if this is your first time tuning into the show, then I hope you enjoy today's episode. The episode, or the topic that I have in today's episode, is a little bit different than what I usually do in my podcast episodes. I'm going to not necessarily be focusing on a specific topic or focusing on a certain body of scientific evidence surrounding a specific topic that's related to endurance sport. I'm more so going to be focusing on the broad concept of, and I put this in air quotes for a reason, doing your own research. It's become a relatively common phrase or quote that people will use when they're researching or looking into a specific topic. They'll say, I'm doing my own research, or I've done my research. And so I first off wanted to touch on what that really means, because doing my own research in air quotes is a little bit misleading. And then secondly, I wanted the main focus of this podcast to be my top tips for you as someone who can consume and digest research and information that's out there. I figured I would impart upon you some tips so that when you are going about doing your own research or digesting information that's out there, you can hopefully be doing it in a more efficient and effective way. And this is by no means going to be a podcast where I give an exhaustive list of everything that you need to do. It's just a few things to consider so that you can make sure that when you are digesting information, consuming information that's out there, whether it's in written text like in a book, or whether you're looking to electronic sources of information on the internet, just making sure that you're going about it in an unbiased way, a more efficient and effective way, so that you can get the most out of the time that you're spending doing your own research. And my motivation for making this episode is fueled by a few different things. It's just common in general for people to, when they're looking into a specific topic, to say, oh, I'm doing my own research, and then they come up with their own conclusion. Another reason is just the recency of this phrase being used so often amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, and I'm not even going to touch on COVID-19 at all in any capacity. I don't want to open up that can of worms, nor is it my place to open up that can of worms. But it's just a relatively common phrase. You hear it all the time from professional athletes or celebrities or politicians. They're doing their own research. And so I guess first, what I wanted to dive into is what someone actually means when they're doing their own research. And I kind of wish the phrase would shift to, I'm reading information that's out there, or I'm looking into the information that we have. Because when people say they're doing their own research, they're not actually doing research, right? They're not running research studies, and they're not in a laboratory or out in the community like doing actual scientific research. That's what researchers and physicians do, people who have been trained in scientific methodology. But what people are really doing is they're looking at information that's out there, whether it's scientific information or not. And it just depends on the topic as well. But for the purpose of this podcast, since usually I'm talking about scientific research, I'm going to focus primarily on how to go about reading your own scientific literature or getting scientific or evidence-based information from various sources. Because there's a few different ways of going about it, right? So when you're doing your own research, you're really reading information that's published, whether it's in written print, in a book, or in a magazine, or in a written journal, a physical journal, or you're gathering information online in online journals or on social media, or from websites or government organization websites. Wherever the source is, you're gathering information of some sort and then coming up with your own conclusion. Now, the problem that most of it, or everyone faces, including scientists who are doing their own research studies, is bias. We all tend to have our own preconceived notion and biases, which is fine. It's just a fact. We tend to approach things with a certain bias and a certain conclusion in mind that we want to be true. And so sometimes it's called the confirmation bias. We tend to cherry pick information that confirms our preconceived notions or biases, and then ignore the information that might dispute it. And we do this with everything. We do it with politics, we do it with nutrition, we do it with sport, we do it with everything. So it's all around us and it's relatively common. And usually the key when you're trying to, hopefully if your goal is to objectively learn more, not just confirm your own bias, if the goal is to actually go out, gather information, and come up with a conclusion that reflects our current understanding of reality, then you want that to be as unbiased as possible. Because again, you're not looking to confirm your own belief, right? Like reality doesn't care what your belief is. You can believe that the earth is flat all you want, but there's enough objective evidence that we have to prove that the earth is spherical. And so it's the same thing when you're approaching different scientific topics. Like if you're looking into a certain exercise physiology topic or a certain nutrition topic, right? There's reality and then there's what people believe to be reality. And so hopefully when you're going about gathering your own information to learn a little bit more about a topic, you're doing it in an unbiased way, which I'll talk about. And you're doing it in a way where you're looking at different sides of the story and not just the one side that you want to be true. So I guess first off, I want to just kind of pick apart that phrase, doing your own research, and really what it should mean and what people should probably say is I'm gathering my own information and coming up with my own, hopefully unbiased and informed conclusion, because we're not actually doing research unless you're a researcher. And then secondly, how do you go about gathering information and coming up with informed conclusions as efficiently and effectively as possible? And this is where most people run into trouble, and it's confusing because there's so much misinformation out there, and you don't know who you can trust, what sources you can trust, what person you can trust, who's giving you good information and bad information. And I guess I'll even shy away from using the terms or the phrases good and bad information, but I guess just truthful and untruthful information. Because it's really difficult, especially when there are professionals out there in a field where you would think that they might know what they're talking about who are spreading misinformation. I've seen really great strength and conditioning coaches, exercise physiologists who share well-intentioned, well-informed information, and then you'll see professionals in the same field sharing complete BS and complete nonsense. And there might be a variety of reasons for that, whether it's just to get more followers on social media because what they're sharing is crazy and wild and wacky and it just attracts interest, or they're sharing a specific point of view that might not necessarily be backed up by evidence, but it is good marketing and it maybe sells a certain product. And so that's kind of what I wanted to dive into primarily with this podcast episode, was just giving you a few tips when you're going about gathering information and trying to decipher what you can trust, because it's really confusing, and I figured that this could be helpful for many people, because what I try and do is I'll try and go about gathering information in an unbiased manner, coming up with conclusions, and then sharing those conclusions with you based on the available evidence that we have and the experience that we have in the field of exercise science as a whole, because that's primarily what I focus on with this podcast, is diving into various topics that fall under the exercise science umbrella for the most part. And sometimes I'll dabble in some different topics that are related to nutrition, exercise psychology, or maybe just like the scientific method in general. But these are the types of things that I keep in mind when I'm gathering information as well, because I will get information from various sources, and not every single source is purely a scientific peer-reviewed journal article. And sometimes we can't necessarily get a well-informed opinion from science because maybe science hasn't caught up to what we're currently doing in practice. And sometimes science doesn't necessarily have the answer for everything. And so sometimes there are certain topics where you're kind of on the fringe of maybe the science experience interface, where someone might be doing something and it might be efficacious, but we just don't have the science to quite support it yet. And so it's mainly based on experience. And so what do you do in those scenarios when there maybe isn't any science out there to inform a conclusion on a certain topic? And so that's the kind of stuff that I really want to dive into with this podcast episode. So let's start diving into some of my top tips. and again, this isn't an exhaustive list. I'm only going to share 3 tips because I think, in my opinion, and based on my experience, these are some of the more important things and important considerations when you're going about gathering your own information, regardless of the source. So number 1 is, if you are looking to scientific papers and abstracts, don't just read like the title or the abstract. Go deeper than whatever the abstract is. And usually with a scientific paper, beyond the abstract, there's an actual introduction, methods, results, and conclusion section. My first tip would be to actually read the whole paper. So the abstracts are great, especially if you're trying to read many papers all at once and you're trying to filter out maybe certain papers that you want to read that are relevant, or that you don't want to read because they're not relevant, and then filter in certain papers that are more relevant and that you want to read into deeper. So a big problem that most people run into is they will just look at the title and then the abstract, and then they'll just basically skip right down to the conclusion of the abstract and read 2 sentences of the entire paper. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. You just don't get the full picture and the full perspective of what the paper is trying to share. So there's a big difference between a 2-line conclusion and then the context of the paper and the problem that the investigators were diving into as a whole. And so my first tip would be to read the whole paper. It would be much better to read 1 or 2 papers in their entirety than it would be to read 10 abstracts, in my opinion, because you're getting more context of what the problem is that someone is investigating. Right? And then when it comes to reading papers, we can break this tip down into like, where should you start when it comes to reading specific papers? So there are a variety of different types of papers that are published. The most common type of scientific paper that's out there is an original research paper, which is a team of researchers ask a question, form some hypotheses, and then they do a specific experiment, or they do a specific type of study to answer that question. And then they'll usually publish that as an original research paper. And so it's just a paper that summarizes a single research study. Now, there are other types of papers that are published that are systematic reviews of the literature, which is usually a summary of many different original research papers. And then there are meta-analysis, which are sometimes teamed up or combined with a systematic review. And they'll actually add... they'll quantify findings across various different original research papers. Usually they're randomized controlled trials. And so usually where I like to start, if I have a question on a specific topic, like let's say I'm wondering if, and I've written about this in the past, and I might have done a podcast on this too, but do compression boots work to enhance or augment recovery between exercise sessions, right? Because it's really common to see people using those recovery boots or the compression boots to improve recovery post-exercise and between training sessions. But do they actually work? So I would go to like Google Scholar or PubMed, and I would try and look for the most recent systematic review or meta-analysis that I can find. And that's because then you get a good feel for the literature that's out there, right? So systematic reviews and meta-analysis usually will systematically filter in all the relevant research that's been done up until this point in time, or at least within the recent past. And so you'll get a good sense for what research is out there. So I've seen some systematic reviews that have tried to answer a specific question and they found 1 relevant paper. So then you can get a good sense that there's not a lot of research out there on that topic. And then how that helps you is, let's just say, going with the compression boot and recovery example, and this is actually sort of the case with this topic because I've looked into this research. But let's just say you go to Google Scholar and you look for the most recent systematic review you can find, and you find one, and there's only like 3 papers that are relevant that they've included. Well, then you know that that field is in its infancy. And so if you're seeing out there in the real world, and let's say you read it too, and it's relatively inconclusive whether or not they help or not. And this is sort of the case with compression boots in general. You can go back and listen to the previous podcast episode where I've discussed this. But with the compression boots, there isn't really conclusive evidence to say whether or not they do anything to benefit recovery. It's mixed, and there's more research than not suggesting that they don't really do anything, right? But yet, if you go to any company's website that sells these boots, they're going to make all these wild claims that aren't necessarily backed up by evidence. And so this isn't to say that the recovery boots do absolutely nothing, because maybe the science just hasn't caught up to it yet, right? But by going about reading scientific papers in a more methodical way and getting a better sense for what's out there and not just cherry picking one specific study that might say that it does something small or it does something minor, then you just get a much better sense of what to make when you come across claims that are made by companies saying that their product does X, Y, and Z. And so you just have a more informed opinion on a certain topic if you have a better sense of the literature in its entirety that's out there, right? That's why we can't just cherry pick a specific study that shows one thing, because one study doesn't prove anything. One study just contributes to our understanding of a topic. And usually we need to have many studies that are done over time to make a relatively firm conclusion on a specific topic. And so looking for systematic reviews and meta-analyses that do that summarize the available literature is usually the best place to start, in my opinion. And then you can obviously go kind of down the rabbit hole a little bit further if you get really intrigued with a specific study that systematic review or meta-analysis cites. You can go in and read individual studies if you want. But really just reading one study or reading just an abstract from one study doesn't tell you a whole lot. It just is like one really small piece of the puzzle, and you're trying to get the whole picture of the puzzle, right? And so by just cherry picking one paper, one abstract, and then sharing that information or digesting and interpreting that information as if that is fact or that is proof of a fact is just misinformed and a little bit misguided, because you're not getting the whole picture, right? You're just getting a snapshot. You're getting one little piece of information. And so reading actual papers in their entirety and reading systematic reviews, meta-analyses, brief reviews, summaries of the literature is the best place to start. It's just more efficient, right? You get a better sense of what's out there in one single paper. Now, usually those papers are a little bit longer because they tend to discuss a lot of research and a lot of different papers, but it's well worth your time to read, say, a whole systematic review on a topic as opposed to trying to read all the papers that were included in that systematic review. So that would be my first tip. Read the actual paper if you are looking into scientific literature, and then start with meta-analyses and systematic reviews on topics. And then if there aren't any, then obviously you know that research field or that topic is relatively new in terms of being studied, and then you can go and find individual papers if you have to. But my tip would be to read the whole paper and start with systematic reviews and meta-analyses, just to get a better sense of what's out there on a specific topic in general. All right, now, not all information and conclusions has to be drawn from scientific research, because there are certain topics where science just doesn't really have a good answer or give us a clear picture of what's out there. And so sometimes we rely a lot on experience and practice and things that have been done over time that in practice have shown to be beneficial, even though there might not necessarily be a sound body of evidence saying that this works or not. So sometimes we'll get information from practitioners or from other researchers out there who are coming up with different conclusions that might be informed by a little bit of research, a little bit of experience. You might be looking to different websites, social media accounts, maybe actual physical books, those sorts of things. So my second tip would be to look for information from professionals or organizations in the field that discuss both sides of a topic, that don't just try and shove down your throat one specific viewpoint. So, for example, let's just say I was really interested in the health benefits of veganism. You could probably go and find some crazy social media accounts from professionals and non-professionals that are just trying to shove veganism down everyone's throat as if it's the saving grace for every single human being on planet Earth, and they don't even want to hear that veganism might have a potential drawback, or that it isn't the solution for certain people, or that some people might feel better when they're on a non-vegan diet. And so those are probably the people you don't want to be listening to because they're very biased in their viewpoint. There is literally no such thing as a one-size-fits-all when it comes to diet, when it comes to exercise, when it comes to nutrition or supplementation, whatever the topic is. There are very few things in life where there's a one-size-fits-all and a specific approach working for every single human being on planet Earth. There are some people who feel really good on a vegan diet, and then there are some people who don't do very well. I've listened to some professional athletes who have tried vegan and non-vegan diets, and when they have meat in their diet, they just feel better. They feel stronger, they're more powerful, their endurance is better, they feel healthier. And so there's no one-size-fits-all. And it's usually the case with most things. If you're coming across a professional or a non-professional and they're only sharing one side of the story and saying that this is the answer no matter what, then I would be a little bit skeptical and try and get your information elsewhere. So you usually want, whether it's on YouTube or Instagram or Facebook, it's not that all social media is all misinformation. There is some really good information out there from professionals and even non-professionals who are providing unbiased, well-informed, well-intentioned information to people. It's just much more common to find misinformation. And so you kind of have to know what to look for. And usually finding people who talk about both sides of a topic or what we know and what we don't know is important. So look for people that use phrases like research suggests or research demonstrates that this might be the case, but we don't have enough information or enough research to say this with confidence. Or look for people that say research might suggest this, but in my experience, I've seen the opposite. You just want to look for people that question things because we don't have proof for most things. And we don't have 100% solid answers for everything. Research, even the decades and centuries of research that we have, on most topics, it isn't conclusive and it doesn't prove anything. We just have research that suggests certain things. And then as we build up evidence on a certain topic, that suggestion might be stronger and stronger, or that conclusion might become more and more firm. But it doesn't prove anything. So if you come across like a professional or someone on, social media, and they read one study and they say science proves this, then just be skeptical. You don't have to not listen to them, but just be skeptical of the information that they're sharing. And this just takes some experience over time to learn kind of what to look for and what to look out for. But my second piece of advice or tip would be to look for information from professionals and organizations, like professional organizations, that discuss both sides of a topic, or at least give off the impression that they're looking into a topic in an unbiased way. So they're not trying to force a specific viewpoint down your throat, because that's usually where most people get tripped up, is they'll get really caught up in, especially if it confirms their own belief. Like if someone is a vegan themselves and they feel really great being on a vegan diet, then they're only going to look for social media accounts or for professionals in the field or dietitians that promote a vegan diet. And they're going to think that a vegan diet is the only way to go for everyone, and they're just going to keep going down that vicious cycle of confirmation bias, and only listening to people that are confirming their own bias. And so that's just the thing to be careful with when you're looking for information from other people. So that would be my second tip. And then my third piece of advice or tip would be to look to professionals that have significant experience or a formal education related to the topic they're discussing. So, for example, exercise science and coaching, right? You wouldn't, or actually I'll use maybe even a more overt example that I like to use with people when I'm kind of discussing this issue. And it's just because misinformation is so rampant, especially amongst fields that aren't very tightly regulated, like exercise and nutrition. So for example, in the medical field, right, the average person can't just go on social media and start making wild medical claims. Especially if they are a doctor, if they are an MD or, a DO and they're making wild claims, then they have the potential to lose their license, or there could be repercussions or consequences. And in some states, there's even rules and regulation against what medical advice can be shared and what can't be shared, depending on your credentials. Whereas in like the nutrition space and the exercise space, it's largely a free-for-all, right? So which makes it even more difficult when it comes to deciphering which information you can trust and not. And so looking to professionals that have experience or education is just like an added assurance that they're hopefully sharing unbiased and well-intentioned information. So obviously you don't have to have a degree in the field that you're talking about to be a reputable source of information. So like I have a master's degree and a bachelor's degree in exercise science, but there are other people that I know of and other professionals in the field who might have come from a different profession in their earlier career, and maybe they went to school for a totally different thing way back in the day, and they've transitioned into exercise science, coaching, strength and conditioning, and they've built up enough experience and they've gone about learning and getting credentialed in the right way that they are a reputable source of information. So, but the thing that they do have is experience, right? So, and you could have both. You could have the formal education and the experience. You could have just formal education. You could have just experience. I think the important thing to look for is whoever is sharing the information, whether it's on exercise or nutrition, a topic related to endurance sport, you want to look to make sure that they have experience or credentials or an education of some sort that would indicate that they have some idea of what they're talking about. So I'll give a really overt example of this in the medical space, right? Like if you had a friend who, let's say they got a cold and they recovered from the cold, right? And maybe they use some over-the-counter NSAIDs or something to manage their pain, or they use some over-the-counter decongestants or something, and they got through the cold, right? And they recovered. You're not going to go to that friend for medical advice because they recovered from a cold, right? And the same thing is true when it comes to other fields like exercise science. Like I would never go to someone who just completed their first triathlon and ask them about coaching advice, right? Like they just did one triathlon. It doesn't make them an expert on that topic. But in today's world, everyone kind of thinks they're an expert on a topic, even if they don't really have much experience or formal education. And there seems to also be this sort of like self-empowering, like I'm an expert because I've done something. And I'm definitely not saying that like just because someone has done 5 or 10 races, they don't know what they're doing, but they know what they're doing when it comes to themselves, right? That doesn't necessarily make them an expert in sharing coaching advice for other people. And it's one thing that frustrates me about the exercise science field in general. I've seen it all throughout undergrad and graduate school when I worked as a personal trainer, and I see it a lot now working as a coach with athletes. And I know dietitians feel sort of the same way because that field is largely unregulated. To a certain extent, sports psychologists feel the same way as well because sports psychology isn't regulated as tightly as maybe general psychology is. But it's really frustrating, when you have individuals all over the place, especially on social media, who don't necessarily have the experience necessary or the education or credentialing necessary to be able to share reliable and accurate information for other people. They just maybe had the experience of getting in shape themselves or doing some races themselves, or they made a dietary change and it worked for them, and now all of a sudden they think they're an expert. And so I say this not to necessarily be judgmental, but just to share the reality so that when you're going about trying to get information from other sources, just making sure that you're getting it from as reliable and reputable of a source as possible, because that's usually where you're going to get the best, unbiased, most accurate and up-to-date information that you can get. And ultimately, all these tips or pieces of advice are just geared towards helping you go about getting information in a more efficient, more unbiased manner, and trying to eliminate as many sources of biased and inaccurate information as possible. And so that would be my third tip is like go to people's bio or their about page on their website or their social media platform and just look at what their experience and credentials is. And if their only source of experience is that they did it themselves, then just be a little skeptical, because what works for one person doesn't work for everyone, and they might just be sharing only what worked for them, which is extremely biased. And so just be skeptical of that. Or if you're going, if you are watching a YouTube channel that's giving medical advice and you come to find out that that person has like a bachelor's degree in English and then they have no experience in the medical field, you would obviously be very skeptical of that person and the information that they're sharing. But people will end up believing that person because they might go into looking for information with a bias that they want to confirm, and then maybe that person confirms that bias for them, and then they're hooked, and then they believe everything that person says. That's kind of how it ends up working out. So just to recap, the 3 pieces of advice: read scientific papers, not just the abstract. And again, I would recommend starting with systematic reviews, meta-analyses, to get a better picture of the research that's out there. And then if you're maybe not as keen on reading scientific research and you want to get just a summary of information or research from professionals, look for information from qualified, certified, credentialed professionals in the field that are talking about the topic that you're interested in. Or look to organizations like professional organizations that discuss the topic that you're interested in, and just make sure that you're looking for professionals and organizations that are discussing both sides of a topic. So if you're interested in sleep, you could go to, say, like the National Sleep Foundation here in the US, and they're a professional academic organization that will give evidence-based recommendations on sleep, and they're obviously going to be looking at the research that's out there and looking at both sides of a topic and not just, forcing biased information down people's throat. So that's the second piece of advice. And then the third one is looking for professionals that have experience or education or credentialing in what they're talking about. So some level of assurance that they sort of know what they're talking about. And that's obviously very hard because it's very, very subjective and you have no idea. And people can, give off the illusion that they are incredibly confident and know exactly what's going on and know what they're talking about. But usually anyone who is extremely sure that they have the answer tends to be biased, because most of what we have out there is just an educated guess, right? Like very few things are 100% certain. Without a doubt, it's going to work for everyone. So anyone who isn't skeptical or who doesn't ask questions, it should be an immediate red flag. So usually professionals who have the right experience or the right education or the right credentialing will usually be skeptical, and they'll ask questions, and they'll use phrases like research suggests or based on my experience, this is what I've seen. And they'll usually avoid phrases like science has proven, or without a doubt this works for everyone, or I have the secret. Those are kind of some red flag phrases to look out for. So hopefully this is helpful for those of you out there who like to dive into topics on your own and try and form opinions for yourself and come to conclusions for yourself on a specific topic. I try and play a small role in that with putting out this podcast and putting out written material on my website. When I share evidence-based information around a topic or share experience surrounding a topic, I try and be as unbiased and methodical in my approach as possible so that I'm putting out the highest quality information that I possibly can. And obviously it's not perfect. It's never going to be perfect. You shouldn't expect anyone that you're listening to have firm answers all the time, because sometimes it is ambiguous. But I think the point is that you're just going about educating yourself in as unbiased of a manner as possible, especially when it comes to the sport or endurance sport. Just going about learning about different topics in as unbiased of a way as possible, I think, is really important. You'll get a better sense of kind of what we know, what we don't know, maybe what the reality is surrounding a certain topic, and then you'll just be that much better informed on the topics that you are interested in, and hopefully that will end up improving your training, your racing, or if you're a coach, it'll improve the quality of the content that you're delivering to the athletes that you're working with as well. And so hopefully that will just overall enhance the experience that those athletes that you're working with have. So again, this podcast I know is a little bit different than typical episodes, but I just felt a desire to put this information into a podcast so that hopefully it can improve your ability as a listener to go out there and come to better, more unbiased conclusions when it comes to whatever topic that you're interested in. As always, if you have any questions on anything that I talked about in this podcast episode, then feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is in the show notes. Usually email is the best way to reach out, and that's at peakenduranceSolutions@outlook.com. I hope you enjoyed this episode, even though it was a little bit different than the usual episode, and I hope you will continue tuning into future episodes. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. The support is greatly appreciated. If you want to support the show a little bit more, I have set up a Patreon link, and I've included that Patreon link in the show notes. So if you feel like giving us a little bit of extra support, feel free to do so through Patreon. Also, feel free to give us a review or a star rating, depending on which platform you are listening on. Those reviews and the feedback is greatly appreciated. And then finally, if you know of someone who would be interested in our podcast show, feel free to share this episode or just the podcast in general with them, and that is greatly appreciated. As always, thank you for tuning into today's episode, and thank you for supporting the show.